The Duke froze the instant she entered his ballroom, wearing the dress he had searched for years. She thought it was only her mother's patched gown. To him, it was something more precious. She entered the ballroom the way she entered every room now, quietly and with her eyes down. The doors behind her were tall and gilded, and the sound of the crowd inside rose up like heat from an open oven. She stepped past the threshold and felt the warmth of 100 candles touch her face. She did not smile. She had learned that smiling too soon only invited questions she could not answer. Her name was Josephine Wren. She was 23 years old. She had no mother, no father, and no dowry to speak of, only a distant aunt who had taken her in out of duty rather than love, and who reminded her of that fact often, in small ways that left no mark anyone else could see. The hall was vast, lit by candles set in silver branches along walls painted the color of cream. The light caught on crystal and on jewels and on the pale shoulders of women who had never once had to mend their own hems. Music drifted from a corner where a small group of musicians played something slow and formal, the kind of tune meant for people who already knew where they belonged in a room like this. Josephine did not know where she belonged, so she found the wall. Around her, the great room seemed to breathe with a life entirely its own, a life she had learned to watch rather than join. Footmen moved silently between clusters of guests, trays balanced with the ease of long practice. Somewhere near the center of the floor, a burst of laughter rose and fell, bright and careless, the kind of laughter that belonged only to people who had never once had to measure their words before speaking them. She stood near a long window draped in heavy green curtain, the fabric thick enough to muffle the cold that pressed against the glass behind it. She folded her hands in front of her, the way she always did, and she waited, though she could not have said for what. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt, somehow, more alone than if you had been standing in an empty field? That was Josephine, tonight, and most nights like it. Her aunt had left her within minutes of arriving, drawn away by the promise of better conversation and better company, the kind that came with better names attached to it. Josephine had not been surprised. She had stopped expecting anything else years ago. Her aunt's name was Mrs. Colic, and she was a thin woman with a narrow face and a narrower patience for anything that did not serve her own standing. She had taken Josephine in 4 years ago, after the last of Josephine's family had gone, not because she wanted a niece under her roof, but because turning the girl away would have cost her more in whispered opinion than keeping her cost in bread and coal. She reminded Josephine of this arrangement often, in the careful way she introduced her to strangers, in the length of pause before she called her niece rather than something colder, in the small, precise cruelties of a woman who had learned that unkindness spoken softly left no mark for others to see. Tonight, before they had left the house, her aunt had looked her over once, from the crown of her head to the hem of her gown, and had said only that a girl with no dowry could not afford to hide herself away. She had not said what a girl with no dowry could afford instead. Josephine had wanted to ask. She had learned, long ago, that asking her aunt anything rarely brought an answer worth having. So she had come. She had let herself be seen, in the only gown she owned fine enough for a room like this, and she had found the nearest wall to stand against, because standing against a wall was, at least, something she knew how to do well. To pass the time, she did the thing she always did in rooms like this. She lifted her right hand, slowly, and smoothed the edge of lace at her left wrist. Then she lifted her left hand and did the same to the lace at her right wrist. She did this 3 times on each side. She could not have explained why 3, only that the number had settled into her the way habits do, quietly and without permission, until it became something her body needed rather than something her mind chose. It steadied her. It gave her hands something honest to do while the rest of the room moved without her. Her dress was pale blue, though it had not always been so pale. Once, years ago, the silk had held a color as bright as a summer sky just after rain. Now it had faded into something softer, something worn thin by seasons and use and time. Along the hem, where the fabric had once caught and torn on the edge of a doorway, there ran a long, careful line of stitching. The thread was slightly darker than the silk around it. Anyone who looked closely would see it. Josephine had done that mending herself 3 nights before, by the light of a single candle that had burned low enough to scald her fingers before she finished. She had let the hem down as far as it would go, because she was taller now than her mother had been when the dress was made, and even then the fabric did not quite reach where it should. A faint line marked where the old hem had sat for years, a shade darker than the silk around it, untouched by sun. She had hoped no one would notice. She did not yet know that someone already had. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like this, of the small back room in the house where she had grown up, where her mother used to sit long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, a needle catching the last light of a dying candle. Her mother had been a seamstress, one of the finest in the county in her time, though her name had never once appeared on the credit for the gowns she made. She had mended and stitched for families grander than her own, families who paid her little and thanked her less. And she had done it with a steadiness Josephine had never fully understood until she found herself doing the very same thing, alone, by candlelight, mending her own inheritance stitch by stitch so that no one would see how little she had left. Her mother had died when Josephine was 19, for years after her father, and in the years since, Josephine had learned to carry herself the way her mother once had, quietly, carefully, taking up as little space in a room as a person could take up while still, technically, being present in it. Across the ballroom, near the great marble hearth where the heat of the fire mixed with the smell of wax and crushed flowers, the Duke of Ravenswood stood in conversation he was not truly having. Men spoke to him. He answered when it was expected. His eyes, however, had already left the conversation behind. He was looking at a young woman by the window, a woman he did not know, wearing a dress he did know. Do you know what it feels like to see a ghost standing quietly across a crowded room, wearing a face you thought you had buried? The Duke's hand tightened slightly around the stem of the glass he held. He did not move at first. He could not. Something in his chest had gone very still, the way a house goes still in the moment before a storm breaks over it. He had seen that mending before. Not that exact stitch, not that exact hand, but the pattern of it, the placement, the particular way the thread crossed and doubled at the corner of the hem. He had seen it on a gown that had once belonged to his mother, a gown she had worn in the last winter of her life, when illness had already begun to take the color from her face and the weight from her frame, though never the warmth from her voice. His mother had been Duchess Cordelia Ravenswood. She had died when he was 21, in a room upstairs in this very house, with the curtains drawn against a sun she said hurt her eyes by the end. He had not spoken of her death in years. Not truly. Not to anyone. Grief, in his experience, was not something a duke was permitted to carry openly. It was something to be folded away, the way one folds away a coat no longer worn, out of season, out of sight. And yet here, in the middle of a ball he had not wanted to host, a stranger stood wearing a ghost of that same careful needlework, and something in him that had been folded away for years came loose at the seams. He remembered, without wanting to, the last winter of his mother's life, when the physicians had stopped speaking with confidence and started speaking with care instead, which was, in his experience, always the worse of the two. He remembered a small group of women who came and went from the house during those months, quiet, capable, unremarkable in the way that people become when no one thinks to look at them closely. He remembered his mother's voice, thin by then, telling him once that the woman mending her gowns had gentler hands than any physician in the county, and that she trusted her more besides. He had not thought of that conversation in years. He had not let himself. Grief, folded away long enough, had a way of feeling like something that belonged to another man entirely, until a stranger's hem unfolded it again in the space of a single held breath. He set his glass down without excusing himself from the conversation he had already abandoned in every way but body. Was it only the dress that stopped him? Or was it the way she stood, so still, so apart, exactly the way his mother used to stand in the last months of her illness, when even standing among friends had begun to feel like standing among strangers? He could not yet say. He knew only that his feet had begun to move before his mind had agreed to it, carrying him around the edge of the dance floor, past clusters of laughing guests who did not notice him leave, toward the window where a young woman in a mended blue gown stood smoothing lace at her wrist that did not need smoothing, waiting, as she always did, for a room to finish forgetting she was in it. Josephine did not see him coming. She was watching the dancers instead, the practiced turn of skirts, the careful distance between gloved hands, the whole quiet performance of a world she had been raised at the edge of, but never quite inside. She thought, briefly, of her mother. She thought of the small back room where her mother used to sit with a needle and thread long after the candles in grander houses had burned down to nothing, mending gowns that were not her own, for families that were not her own, for wages that never quite matched the hours spent. She thought of the particular quiet her mother used to fall into while she worked, a stillness Josephine had never fully understood until she found herself standing in it tonight, in this dress, in this room. She did not know that the man crossing the ballroom toward her had spent the last 4 years of his life quietly searching for a family whose name he had lost, a family whose kindness he had never properly repaid, a family connected to the very stitches now catching candlelight at the hem of her gown. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the air near the window had changed, the way air changes just before a door opens somewhere in a house and lets in a draft from outside. She looked up. A man stood a few steps away, dressed in dark formal clothes that marked him as someone of consequence, though she did not yet know his name. He was not smiling. He was staring at her hem the way a man stares at something he has been searching for so long he no longer trusts his own eyes to have found it. Josephine's hands stilled at her wrist. 3 times each side, she had promised herself. She had only managed 2. What would you do if a stranger crossed a crowded room and looked at you as though you were something he had lost and never expected to find again? Josephine did not know what to do either. She only knew that whatever was about to happen would not let her stand quietly by the curtain a moment longer. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he was taller than she had realized from across the room, and there was something unguarded in his expression that did not match the composed, distant manner she had always assumed men of his rank carried like a second coat. His eyes had not left the hem of her gown, not fully, even now that he stood close enough to speak to her directly. She dropped into the small, careful curtsy her aunt had drilled into her since childhood, the kind that asked for nothing and promised even less. She waited for him to introduce himself, as custom demanded, or to move past her toward someone more deserving of his attention, as she half expected he would. He did neither. For a long moment, he only looked at her, and in that moment Josephine felt something she had not felt in years, not since her mother had been alive to look at her that same way, as though she were being truly seen rather than simply noticed. It unsettled her more than any cruelty her aunt had ever offered. The music continued somewhere behind him, distant now, as though the room itself had thinned to make space for whatever was coming next. The candles along the wall guttered once in a draft from the tall windows, and the light across his face shifted, and for a heartbeat he looked less like a duke and more like a man standing at the edge of a memory he had not given himself permission to enter in a very long time. Josephine did not know his name yet. She did not know why he had crossed an entire ballroom to stand in front of a girl no one else in the room had thought worth approaching all evening. She only knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that whatever he was about to say would change the shape of the evening entirely. What do you think he saw, standing there, close enough now to be certain of what he had only suspected from across the room? He opened his mouth to speak. "Forgive me," he said, though the words came out rougher than he intended, as though he had not used his voice in some time. "I do not mean to startle you." Josephine straightened from her curtsy, uncertain what to do with a duke who apologized before he had even introduced himself. She said nothing at first. She had learned, in rooms like this, that silence was often safer than speech. "Your gown," he said. He seemed to catch himself the moment the words left him, as though he had meant to say something else entirely, and this was the only version his mind had allowed through. "Forgive me. That is a strange thing to say to a stranger." "It is my mother's," Josephine said. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She had not expected to explain herself tonight, least of all to a man she did not know. But something in his manner made the explanation feel necessary, almost owed. She is no longer living. I altered it myself. Have you ever watched someone absorb a piece of information the way the ground absorbs rain after a long drought, as though they had been waiting for it without knowing they were waiting at all? That was the Duke, in the moment after she spoke. His eyes moved once more to the hem, to the careful line of stitching that caught the candlelight whenever she shifted her weight. Something in his jaw tightened. The stitching, he said, along the hem. Might I ask who taught you to sew in that particular pattern? It was an odd question, and she knew it was odd even as he asked it, but there was nothing idle in the way he asked it. He was not making conversation. He was searching for something, the way a man searches a dark room for a door he knows must be there. My mother taught me, Josephine said. She was a seamstress, one of the finest, though you would not have heard her name. She mended gowns for families who never once thanked her properly. Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and involuntary, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. Do you know the particular ache of hearing a stranger describe, without knowing it, someone you have spent years trying not to think about? The Duke did not answer her right away. His mind had already begun to pull him backward, past the candlelight and the music and the girl standing in front of him, back into a room he had not let himself enter in 4 years. He remembered it now, the way memory returns not gently but all at once, like a door blown open by wind rather than opened by a hand. The room upstairs, dim even at midday because his mother could no longer bear bright light. The smell of medicine and beeswax and something sweeter underneath, the crushed lavender the physician said might ease her breathing, though nothing, in truth, had eased anything by the end. He remembered the women who came each morning and left each evening, quiet and unremarkable in the particular way that people become when a household is too consumed by grief to notice who tends to it. He remembered one woman especially, though he had not thought of her face in years, only her hands, always moving, always careful, mending the hems of his mother's gowns so that even in illness, even confined to a single darkened room, the Duchess Cordelia Ravenswood might still feel, for a few hours each day, like herself. He remembered his mother's voice near the end, thinner than it had ever been, telling him that the woman who mended her gowns had a daughter, a clever little thing with quick hands, who would one day sew as beautifully as her mother did, if given the chance. He had not asked the woman's name. He had been 21 and grief-stricken, and certain there would be time enough later to properly thank the people who had cared for his mother in her final months. There had not been time. Within a fortnight of his mother's death, the house had changed hands in every quiet way a house changes hands after a death, staff reassigned, routines dissolved, and the women who had come each morning simply stopped coming, and no one had thought, in the chaos of grief, to ask where they had gone or to ensure they were properly paid for what they had given. He had spent 4 years now, quietly, without ever quite admitting it to himself as a formal search, trying to recall a name he had never bothered to learn. Your Grace. Josephine's voice pulled him back into the room. He realized, with some discomfort, that he had been silent for longer than was proper, and that she was watching him now with the particular caution of someone who has learned to expect strangeness from powerful men and has trained herself not to react to it. Forgive me, he said again. I find I have forgotten myself entirely this evening. May I ask your name? Josephine, she said. Josephine Wren. He went very still. Wren. The name settled into him the way a stone settles into still water, sending out small, quiet ripples that reached every part of him at once. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in years, and yet some part of him recognized it instantly, the way one recognizes a voice from another room before the mind has fully caught up to the recognition. What would you do if the answer to a question you had carried for 4 years suddenly stood in front of you, wearing a mended blue gown, entirely unaware of what her own name meant to the man asking it? He did not know, yet, with certainty. A name alone was not proof, and yet something in his chest had gone tight and urgent, and he found himself unwilling, or perhaps unable, to say anything further on the matter until he was certain. Wren, he repeated, quietly, almost to himself. Yes, Josephine said, uncertain now, watching the strange stillness that had settled over him. Have I said something wrong, Your Grace? No, he said, too quickly. No, you have not. But his hands, she noticed, were no longer steady. He had the look of a man standing at the edge of something he was not yet prepared to fall into. And for a moment Josephine thought he might say more, might finally explain the strange intensity with which he had crossed the room to reach her. He did not. Forgive me, he said a third time, and this time the words came with a small, formal bow, the kind a man gives when he intends to leave rather than to stay. I fear I am poor company this evening. I hope you will excuse me. And then he was gone, moving back through the crowd with a haste that drew more than one curious glance from guests who had never before seen the Duke of Ravenswood leave a conversation so abruptly, nor look, as he did now, like a man walking away from a fire he was not yet ready to put out. Josephine remained by the window, her hands stilled at her wrist, 3 times on each side forgotten entirely. Had she said something wrong? Or had she, without meaning to, said something far too right? She turned the question over in her mind the way she turned over the lace at her wrists, without quite knowing what to do with it. She had not intended to draw attention tonight. She had certainly not intended to unsettle a duke with nothing more than her own name. A pair of young ladies nearby had noticed the exchange, and Josephine caught the low murmur of their voices even as she pretended not to hear. They wondered aloud who the plain girl by the window could possibly be, to have drawn the Duke of Ravenswood across an entire ballroom, only to send him fleeing moments later as though she had said something scandalous. Josephine felt her cheeks warm, though she had done nothing wrong, save answer a question honestly. Her aunt found her not long after, drawn back by whispers that had reached even the card-room. Mrs. Collick's eyes were sharp with a curiosity she did not bother to disguise. "What did you say to him?" her aunt asked, without preamble. "Nothing," Josephine said. "He asked about my dress. I told him it was my mother's. I told him my name." Her aunt's expression shifted, calculation moving behind her eyes the way it always did when she scented some possible advantage. "Your name?" she repeated slowly. "And he left, just like that?" "Yes." Mrs. Collick said nothing further, though Josephine could see her filing the moment away, as she filed away every small piece of information that might later prove useful. For her own part, Josephine could not stop thinking of the look on his face in that last moment, the way his composure had cracked before he caught himself and fled. It had not been the look of a man offended. It had been the look of a man who had seen something he had spent a very long time searching for, and had not been prepared, after all, to find it. She did not have long to consider it further. Her aunt soon steered her toward departure, and within the hour Josephine found herself in the carriage home, the window fogged with cold, the mended hem of her mother's gown pulled quietly around her feet, carrying whatever meaning it carried into the dark without offering her any answers of her own. She did not know that 4 miles away, in a house grown quiet with the particular silence of old grief, the Duke of Ravenswood was already climbing the stairs 2 at a time, his coat still buttoned, his cravat still perfectly tied, moving with a purpose he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. He went first to his study, then thought better of it, and turned instead toward the east wing of the house, toward a room that had remained, since his mother's death, almost entirely untouched. The door stuck slightly from disuse. He pushed it open with more force than was strictly necessary, and the smell that met him, faint now, beneath years of dust and stillness, was unmistakably his mother's, lavender and old paper and something fainter beneath both. Have you ever kept a room exactly as it was, not because you visited it, but because you could not bear to change it? He crossed to a small writing desk near the window, one he had not opened in 4 years, and drew a brass key from an inner pocket of his coat, a key he had carried, he realized now, out of habit rather than intention, as though some part of him had always known he would need it again eventually. The desk drawer stuck, then gave. Inside, beneath a stack of correspondence he did not have the composure to read tonight, lay a slim leather journal, its cover worn soft with handling, though not his own. His mother's hand had filled its pages in her final year, in the small, careful script she had used even when her strength was failing her. He had read it once, in the raw weeks after her death, and had not been able to bring himself to open it since. He opened it now. His fingers moved past entries he remembered only faintly, notes on the weather, on visitors, on small domestic matters that had once made up the ordinary texture of her days. He turned the pages more quickly than he meant to, searching for something he could not yet name, until his eyes caught on a single line, written in his mother's failing hand, dated some months before her death. Mrs. Wren came again today. Her daughter accompanied her for the first time. A quiet, watchful child, no older than 19, with her mother's careful hands and, I think, her mother's careful heart besides. I have told Alistair nothing of what this family has done for me. I fear I have left a debt in this house that will outlast me. The Duke sat very still, the journal open in his lap, the candle beside him burning low, and for the first time in 4 years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything he had failed, until tonight, to remember. He read the line again. Mrs. Wren, a daughter, no older than 19 at the time the entry was written, which meant she would be 3 or 4 and 20 now. If this was even the same family and not some cruel trick of coincidence. But he did not believe in coincidence tonight, not with the hem of that gown still fixed so clearly in his mind. He turned back through the earlier pages, searching now with real purpose, and found other entries scattered across his mother's final year, each brief, each easy to have missed entirely if he had not known what he was looking for. Mrs. Wren came again. Mrs. Wren stayed the full afternoon. I confess her company does me more good than the physician's drafts. Mrs. Wren's daughter is a clever, watchful girl. I should like Alistair to know her family properly, one day, when I am well enough to arrange it. She had never been well enough. The arrangement had never come. And in the chaos that followed her death, an entire family who had given his mother comfort in her final months had simply vanished from the record, unpaid, unthanked, unremembered by everyone in this house except his mother herself, and only on paper. What would you do, discovering on a single quiet night that a debt you never knew you owed had been waiting for years for you to notice it? The Duke closed the journal slowly, his hand resting on its worn cover, as though he might draw further answers from it by touch alone. Outside, the house had gone fully silent, the way great houses do in the deep hours of the night. And something told him, with a certainty he could not quite explain, that when he found the proof he now intended to seek, nothing in his carefully ordered life would remain quite the same again. Morning came gray and reluctant to the house, though the Duke had not slept enough to notice the difference between night and day. He had spent the hours after reading his mother's journal moving through the East Wing, like a man searching a house he no longer fully recognized. Opening drawers he had not opened in years, unfolding letters he had once judged too painful to read a second time. The candle beside him had long since burned to nothing, and still he had not stopped. Each letter he unfolded seemed to lead to another, small threads of his mother's final year gathering slowly into a shape he had not expected and could not now set aside. He found mention of physicians, of remedies tried and abandoned, of visitors received and visitors turned away, and threaded through nearly every page, in his mother's own careful hand, the same 2 words returning again and again like a quiet refrain, Mrs. Wren. Have you ever gone looking for a single answer and found, instead, an entire history you had chosen not to see? By the time the household staff began to stir, the Duke had assembled a small collection on the desk before him. His mother's journal, 3 letters in her hand addressed to a housekeeper long since retired, and a ledger he had nearly forgotten existed, kept by the physician who had attended the Duchess Cordelia in her final year. He sent for the ledger's current keeper before he had even changed out of the previous night's clothes. The physician, Dr. Halsey, arrived within the hour, an older man now, though the Duke remembered him still as younger, more certain, the sort of man who had once spoken to a grieving 21-year-old with careful, practiced gentleness. He did not seem surprised by the summons. He seemed, if anything, as though he had been waiting a long time for someone in this house to finally ask. You kept records, the Duke said, without preamble. of everyone who attended my mother during her final year. Everyone, not only the physicians. I did, Dr. Halsey said. It was my habit, in those days, to note who came and went from a sick room. It helps, sometimes, in understanding how an illness progresses, who a patient responds to, who eases them, and who does not. He paused. Your mother responded, very particularly, to one family in especial. The Duke's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. Wren, he said. Dr. Halsey did not look surprised to hear the name spoken first. Mrs. Wren, yes. A seamstress by trade, though by the end she had become something closer to a companion. Her daughter joined her in the final months. I noted it at the time, because your mother's spirits improved measurably on the days the girl came with her. It was a small thing, perhaps, to a physician's eye, but I have long believed that comfort does more for the dying than medicine ever can, and I have rarely seen it offered so freely or so quietly as it was by that family. The Duke said nothing for a long moment. He found he could not quite trust his own voice. What do you feel, learning that a stranger's presence once did more to ease your mother's suffering than anything money could purchase? The Duke asked to see the ledger itself, and Dr. Halsey produced it from the leather case he had carried in, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. The Duke turned the pages himself now, his own hands unsteady in a way he was not accustomed to, until he found the entries he was searching for, dated across the final 10 months of his mother's life. Mrs. E. Wren, seamstress, attended. Miss J. Wren, daughter, attended for the first time, remained through the afternoon. Mrs. Wren and daughter attended together, 6 hours. Payment owed, 3/4 outstanding. The Duke stopped on that last line and read it twice. Payment owed, he said. 3/4 outstanding. What does that mean? Dr. Halsey's expression grew careful in the particular way of a man about to deliver news he suspects will not be well received. It means, Your Grace, that the household steward at the time fell behind in wages owed to several of the staff and hired help during your mother's final months. Your family's own grief and the chaos following her death having disrupted the usual order of things. Most accounts were eventually settled. Mrs. Wren's was not among them. By the time anyone might have corrected the oversight, she and her daughter had already stopped coming, and no one, in the confusion that followed, thought to seek them out. The Duke sat back slowly, the ledger still open beneath his hands, and felt something in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but some difficult combination of both, directed entirely at himself. Is there a particular weight to discovering that the people who quietly held your family together were the very people your family forgot to thank? How much, he asked, was owed? Dr. Halsey named a sum that was, in the context of the Ravenswood estate, almost embarrassingly small. It would have cost the household nothing to settle it properly, even in the depths of mourning. And yet it had not been settled, not in 4 years, not until a chance encounter at a ball had forced the debt back into the light. I want their direction, the Duke said. Wherever the Wren family may be found now. I want it before the day is out. Dr. Halsey inclined his head and departed to make inquiries, and the Duke was left alone with the ledger, the journal, and a decision he had already, in some quiet part of himself, begun to make. He sat for a long while after the physician had gone, the morning light now fully risen beyond the windows, though it offered little warmth against the chill that had settled over him since the previous night. He thought of every ball he had hosted since his mother's death, every guest he had greeted, every small courtesy he had extended to men and women of consequence, while a family who had given his own mother genuine comfort went unpaid, unthanked, and eventually unremembered entirely. It was not a comfortable thought, and he did not try to make it one. He did not intend to settle the debt quietly. A private payment, delivered by a steward or a solicitor, would clear the ledger and clear his conscience and change nothing at all about the years his mother's caretakers had spent unseen and unthanked. It was not money the Wren family had been owed, not truly, not only. It was recognition. It was the simple, difficult acknowledgement that their kindness had mattered, that it had been noticed, that it would not be allowed to remain any longer a quiet line in a physician's ledger that no one but he would ever read. He thought of the countless small gestures a family might make over months of quiet service. Gestures that left no mark in any account book, no line in any ledger, and yet mattered more, in the end, than anything that could be purchased. He thought of his mother's final months, softened, however briefly, by hands that asked for nothing beyond what was owed and did not even receive that. It was a debt that could not truly be repaid in coin, whatever some Dr. Halsey had named, and the Duke found himself unwilling to pretend otherwise by settling it as though it were nothing more than an overdue tailor's bill. He wanted the whole room to hear it. He wanted every guest who had ever looked past Josephine Wren without a second glance to understand, all at once, exactly whose daughter she was, and exactly what her family had given his, without ever asking for anything in return. Across the city, in a house far smaller and far colder than the Duke's, Josephine had troubles of her own that had nothing at all to do with Dukes or debts or journals kept in dust-covered rooms. Her aunt had summoned her to the small parlor that morning with an expression Josephine had learned, over 4 years, to recognize and to dread. Mrs. Colic did not call for private conversation unless she intended to discuss Josephine's future, and Josephine's future, in her aunt's estimation, was a matter requiring urgent and practical correction. "Mr. Dunmore has expressed interest," her aunt said, without preamble, settling into her chair with the satisfied air of a woman who believed she had solved a difficult problem. "He is not young, and he is not handsome, but he is comfortable, and he has agreed to overlook your circumstances." Josephine's stomach tightened. She had met Mr. Dunmore twice, both times briefly, and both times had come away with the distinct impression of a man who collected wives the way other men collected hunting dogs, for their usefulness and their obedience rather than for any particular affection. "I had not thought to marry so soon," Josephine said carefully. "You had not thought to marry at all, it seems, given how little effort you have made toward it," her aunt replied, not unkindly, though not kindly either. "You are 23, Josephine. You have no dowry and no particular beauty to compensate for it. Mr. Dunmore's offer will not remain open indefinitely, and I do not intend to support you indefinitely either, should it close." Josephine wanted to ask why her worth should be measured only in what a man might be willing to overlook, but she had learned, long ago, that such questions were never welcomed in this house, only met with a longer, colder silence than the one that had prompted them. She thought, instead, of her mother, who had married for love despite having even less to offer than Josephine did now, and who had never once, in all the difficult years that followed, spoken of that choice with regret. What would you do, faced with a choice between a life you did not want and the fear of having no choice at all? Josephine said nothing further. She had learned, long ago, that arguing with her aunt rarely changed the outcome, only delayed it, and delay, in this instance, felt like the only small mercy still within her power to secure. She excused herself as soon as she reasonably could and returned to her small room upstairs, where her mother's sewing basket still sat by the window, untouched since the night she had mended the hem of the blue silk gown. She did not know, as she sat with the basket in her lap and her thoughts far from the small parlor downstairs, that a decision was already being made on her behalf in a house she had never visited, by a man whose name she had learned only the night before. 3 days passed before the letter arrived. It came by private courier, addressed not to Mrs. Colic, as was proper for a household matter, but to Miss Josephine Wren directly, in a hand Josephine did not recognize, sealed with wax bearing a crest she recognized instantly, having seen it, briefly, on the signet ring of a man who had once looked at her hem as though it were the answer to a question he had spent years asking. Her aunt intercepted it first, of course, turning it over twice in her hands, searching the seal for meaning before reluctantly surrendering it into Josephine's own. The letter itself said little. It requested, in formal and unrevealing language, the presence of Miss Josephine Wren and her family at a gathering to be held the following week at Ravenswood House, on a matter the Duke described only as one of considerable personal importance, which he intended to address before the full company in attendance. It gave no further explanation. It offered no further clue. Josephine turned the paper over, as though some hidden message might reveal itself on the blank reverse. But there was nothing, only the Duke's precise, unrevealing hand, and the seal that had already told her more, in its way, than the words themselves. Josephine read it 3 times, searching each time for some detail she might have missed, some hint of what awaited her behind the Duke's careful, formal phrasing. She found none. What do you imagine waits for a woman summoned, without explanation, to stand before an entire room at a Duke's request? Her aunt, for her part, had already begun speculating aloud, her earlier talk of Mr. Dunmore forgotten entirely in the face of this new and considerably more interesting development. Josephine listened without truly hearing, the letter still trembling faintly in her hands, and found herself caught between 2 feelings she could not easily separate: a rising, unfamiliar hope, and a fear, deeper still, of what it might cost her if that hope proved, in the end, to be nothing more than a mistake. Ravenswood House stood ablaze with light by the time Josephine's carriage reached the gates, every window glowing gold against the deepening dark, and for a long moment she sat perfectly still, unable to make herself reach for the door. Have you ever stood at the edge of something you could not name, certain only that your life would look different on the other side of it? Her aunt had spent the entire ride speculating aloud, weaving elaborate theories about connections and considerations, about what the Duke of Ravenswood might possibly want with a family of no particular consequence. And Josephine had let the words wash past her without truly hearing them, her attention fixed instead on the letter she had read so many times the creases had begun to soften. She wore her mother's gown again tonight. She had not planned to. She owned, in truth, one other dress fine enough for an occasion such as this, newer, unmended, entirely her own. But something had stopped her, as she stood before her small mirror that evening, from reaching for anything but the pale blue silk with its careful, visible stitching. It felt, somehow, less like a choice than an instinct, the same instinct that had guided her mother's needle 3 nights before the last ball, mending a history neither of them had fully understood the weight of until now. The footman who received her at the door did not treat her as she had grown accustomed to being treated in houses grander than her own. He bowed with the same careful formality he might have offered any lady of consequence, and something in that small courtesy unsettled her more than any slight would have. Inside, the entrance hall alone seemed larger than the entirety of her aunt's house, its walls lined with portraits of Ravenswood ancestors who gazed down at her with the polite indifference of people long accustomed to being looked at rather than looking. Josephine kept her eyes forward, her hands folded before her in the old, familiar posture, and let herself be led toward the ballroom beyond. The ballroom itself was fuller than the last. Candlelight multiplied 100-fold across gilt mirrors and polished floors, and Josephine felt, the moment she crossed the threshold, the particular weight of being looked at by people who did not yet know why they were looking. Word had traveled, as word always does in circles such as this. She caught fragments of it in passing, murmured between fans and behind gloved hands. Speculation about the girl in the mended gown who had somehow drawn the Duke of Ravenswood across an entire ballroom only a fortnight before, and had now been summoned, by name, to whatever this evening intended to reveal. What does it feel like to walk into a room already full of your own story, told by people who have never once spoken a word to you? Josephine kept close to her aunt, who for once seemed genuinely uncertain how to comport herself, caught between her habitual disdain and a new, cautious deference she could not quite suppress. Josephine said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that silence served her better than speculation, and tonight, more than any other night, she needed whatever steadiness silence could offer. She had not been standing by the window more than a quarter of an hour when the music, quite suddenly, stopped. The change rippled through the room the way a held breath ripples through a crowd, conversation dying in patches, then all at once, until the great hall had fallen into a hush so complete that Josephine could hear her own heartbeat over the last fading notes of the strings. The Duke of Ravenswood stood near the great hearth, exactly where she had first seen him a fortnight before, though nothing about him tonight resembled the distracted, distant man from that first encounter. He stood straight, composed, his expression carrying a gravity Josephine had not yet seen him wear. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, the voice of a man well accustomed to being heard and rarely so nervous about it. "I find I have a story to tell tonight, and I find I can no longer wait to tell it." A murmur passed through the crowd, curiosity threading quickly into anticipation. Josephine felt her aunt's hand tighten, briefly, on her arm. "4 years ago," the Duke began, "my mother, the Duchess Cordelia, fell gravely ill. Those of you who knew her will remember how quickly it happened, and how little any of us, myself included, were prepared to face it. In the final months of her life, she was attended by physicians of considerable skill and considerable cost. And yet it was not the physicians who eased her most." He paused, and for a moment the composed formality he had entered the room with seemed to slip, revealing something raw beneath it, something the assembled guests had likely never before seen in the Duke of Ravenswood's carefully guarded expression. "Do you know what it is to hear the beginning of a story and feel, somewhere beneath your ribs, that it is about to become your own?" Josephine did not yet understand why her chest had grown tight, why some instinct beneath conscious thought had already begun to recognize the shape of what was coming. "There was a woman," the Duke continued, "a seamstress by trade, who came to my mother's rooms not for wages worth mentioning, but because my mother requested her company, and because she gave it freely, day after day, through months that grew steadily harder for everyone in that house. In her final months, this woman was joined by her daughter, a young woman who sat with my mother, mended her gowns, and brought her, by every account I have since gathered, more comfort than any remedy the physicians prescribed." The room had gone entirely still now. Every face turned toward the Duke, though Josephine could feel, without looking, that several had already begun turning toward her instead. "When my mother died," he went on, and here his voice caught, briefly, before he steadied it. "The household fell into the particular disorder that grief brings to even the most careful of families. Wages went unpaid, names went unrecorded, and a family who had given my mother genuine kindness in her final, frightened months was allowed to simply disappear from our records, without thanks, without payment, without so much as a letter acknowledging what they had done. What would it feel like to hear a room fall utterly silent around a truth you had carried alone for years, never expecting anyone else to notice it?" "I did not know their name," the Duke said. "Not truly. Not until a fortnight ago, when I saw a young woman standing near a window at this very ball, wearing a gown mended with a particular, careful stitch I recognized instantly, though I could not, at first, say why." Every eye in the room had found Josephine now. She felt the weight of it settle over her like a physical thing, and she did not move, could not move, caught entirely between the urge to flee and the strange, rising certainty that fleeing was no longer possible. "Her name," the Duke said, his gaze finding Josephine's across the crowded room and holding it, "is Miss Josephine Wren. Her mother was Mrs. Eleanor Wren, the seamstress who eased my own mother's final months with a kindness this family never properly repaid. I have spent the past fortnight confirming what I suspected the moment I saw her, and I can say with certainty, before every person gathered here tonight, that I owe this family a debt I can never fully repay, though I intend, from this evening forward, to spend considerable effort trying." A ripple moved through the crowd, murmurs rising and falling like wind through tall grass, and Josephine, standing very still by the window, felt every one of those murmurs land somewhere beneath her skin. Her aunt, beside her, had gone entirely rigid, her earlier uncertainty replaced now by something closer to astonishment, as though the very ground beneath her had quietly rearranged itself while she was not looking. Josephine caught, from the corner of her eye, the particular way her aunt's expression shifted from disbelief to something almost like calculation, as if already reconsidering every dismissive word she had ever spoken about her niece's prospects. It was, Josephine thought, A very small thing to notice in so large a moment. And yet she noticed it all the same, and found she felt no particular need to forgive it just yet. The Duke crossed the room toward her, exactly as he had a fortnight before, though this time every guest in attendance watched him do it. And this time Josephine did not lower her eyes. "Miss Wren," he said, stopping before her, his voice softer now, meant for her though the room could still hear every word. "I owe your family more than I can properly express tonight, though I intend to spend a great deal of time trying. Your mother gave my own mother comfort when comfort was scarce, and asked for nothing in return. That kind of devotion deserves to be seen, not buried in a ledger no one thought to open." Josephine found she could not speak. Her hands, at her sides, had begun their old habit without her permission, though she stilled them now, deliberately, because some part of her understood, with sudden clarity, that she no longer needed to hide her nervousness behind small, careful gestures. "Not here. Not tonight. Have you ever watched the story you believed about yourself quietly rewritten, in real time, in front of everyone who once believed the old version? The dress that had marked her, for years, as a girl too poor to own anything new, now caught the candlelight as though it had been made for this exact moment. Its careful mended stitching no longer a mark of what she lacked, but of everything her mother had quietly given, and everything Josephine herself had learned to carry forward, unknowingly, into a room that had finally understood its worth." The Duke reached for her hand, and did not let it go. Around them, Josephine could sense the entire room holding itself in careful suspension. Guests who only moments before had regarded her with polite indifference, now watching with an attention so complete it felt almost physical, 100 pairs of eyes fixed on the space between her hand and his. "I do not intend," he said, his voice carrying once more across the silent room, "to let this family go unrecognized any longer. And I find, Miss Wren, that my interest in you has grown to be rather more than a matter of debts owed." He paused, and for the first time that evening, something almost unguarded crossed his composed features. "I should like your permission to court you, openly, before every person gathered here tonight, so that no one in this room, or beyond it, might ever again mistake your worth." The silence that followed felt, to Josephine, longer than the whole fortnight that had preceded it. She thought of her mother, bent over candlelight with a needle in her careful hands, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, and receiving, in the end, nothing but the quiet dignity of work well done. She thought of every ballroom she had stood at the edge of, every whispered judgment she had learned not to hear, every year she had spent believing her own worth was something to be measured against a dowry she did not have. And she thought, now, of a room full of people who had watched that entire story rewritten in the space of a single evening. "Yes," she said, quietly, though the word carried, somehow, to every corner of the silent hall. The room did not erupt into applause, not immediately. It held, instead, in a long, suspended moment of collective understanding, as though every person present had needed that pause to fully absorb what they had just witnessed. What do we truly owe the people who serve quietly and ask for nothing in return?
Subscribe for more interesting Duke-related stories.